Hi, Romans here and welcome to the video about the making of the Pursuits in Life 2 Vortex Fragoris album. I made a similar video, 3-part series actually, called Studio Documentary for the first album, where a lot of the studio footage was accompanied by the commentary by Stevie, the keyboard player on the first album, and me. Here it's gonna be kind of the same. I'm gonna comment on a lot of the things. I'm gonna talk about the whole process. You're gonna see a lot of the footage. I actually had around 2 hours of footage, which I trimmed down to like half an hour or maybe even less. Few things at the beginning. The making of Pursuits in Life 1 and Pursuits in Life 2 couldn't be more different from each other. As I mentioned in the studio documentary for Pursuits in Life 1, I got together a lineup. We rehearsed for like 3.5 months. We went to the studio, and basically from the moment of setting up the drums until the album was finished, it was 103 hours. So that's a little bit over 12 days, 8 hours per day working in a studio. That's pretty impressive considering that the first album is pretty complex. There's a lot to play, so even a lot of the big bands don't record records so quickly. The first big difference between the first and the second album was that with the first album, as I mentioned already, we rehearsed for 3.5 months. For the second album, there were no rehearsals whatsoever. That was for two reasons. First reason, the lineup was constantly changing, but the bigger reason was that 2020 and 2021, those were the COVID years. We couldn't really get together and rehearse, and I still remember that in May 2021, when we went to the studio to record the drums, that was the day when a lot of the regulations were lifted and people were allowed to meet in groups. So that was pretty crazy. As I've mentioned already, the first album took around 100 hours, everything from recording, mixing, mastering, editing. The second album was just 84 hours of editing, mixing, and mastering. Another big difference was that apart from the drums, which we recorded in the same studio where we made the whole first album, everything else was recorded in my home studio. So that means lead and backing vocals, bass, keyboards, synths, and saxophone. Everything was recorded at my house. Before this, I remember in summer 2020, it was a couple months of research trying to find the best gear that I would use. Also, the studio where we recorded the first album relocated, so even though we recorded drums and mixed and mastered the album in the same studio by the same audio engineer, Roman Šoltis, the studio relocated. When we made the first album, it was in Košice, which is the second biggest city in Slovakia, and it's about an hour drive from where I live. Roman relocated the studio to Lipany, which is like this village about 2 hours away from where I live. And the last big difference was that I probably mentioned this. The first album, Pursuits in Life 1, was very expensive. At that time, it cost me my half a year's wage as a teacher. I'm not gonna tell you how much that is because that number is gonna mean different things in different countries, but it was a lot of money. And the second album, Pursuits in Life 2, cost twice as much, even though now as a teacher I basically earn twice as much. I was also able to get some money for the record. Basically, I got 3/4 of the first album's budget from the Slovak Arts Council. I got some money from the Music Fund, and last year we had a crowdfunding for covering the costs of printing 300 CDs. The campaign was successful, so I was able to have like 63% of the funding for the album. It still means that I had to pay quite a lot of it out of my own pocket, but 63% is pretty great. The disadvantage, of course, was that I had to work with the deadline, and the deadline was pretty strict. And that was the first time when I was genuinely forcing myself to work, and I really had to work because considering the deadline, you had to finish the project in order to be able to keep the money, otherwise you would have to return it. I'm gonna make a video about everything that went wrong with the album. There's gonna be so many stories, so be sure to check that video out. The whole album was made in a way that approximately in May or June 2020, I started putting the songs together. Some of the stuff had already been written, some of it I was writing as we went, but basically when the song was finished, meaning that I could sit down with the guitar or by the piano and play the song from start to finish, that's when I recorded the demos. I would record a guitar or a piano, I would have a click track, I would record some lead and backing vocals, I would usually create some drum patterns and some drum grooves. I would add bass guitar with a lot of pedal effects, eventually getting rid of the guitar tracks. Then I would add some synths and keyboards, and all of these demos I would be sending to the rest of the band members. In 2020, I made 5 demos, so that was Fan Haters, Distant Faces in the Dark, Lonely Crossings, My Biggest Four, Wrong Doors. And then in 2021, I basically started with Vortex Fragoris, which took me like 3 months. Then I did Pioneers and Golden Times. Only Vortex and Golden Times were the 2 tracks where I wrote the lyrics for. In the summer Summer 21 during the recording of the album. A lot of the things were lifted from the demo, which was good. One story I forgot to mention with how I wrote the music was the Vortex Fragoris. The song has 6 parts, and the part 5, Ocean of Noise, where you have all of those vocals, that was lifted from the demo. Basically how I recorded it, still as a part of a demo, it basically just like that. Nothing was altered, edited, tuned, whatever. It's just some reverb. And I remember when Roman was listening to it in the studio, he was like, what is this part? And at the end he was like, oh, that was pretty interesting. And I told him, man, I'm so not looking forward to re-recording the whole section. And he looked at me and was like, why do you want to re-record it? And I was like, well, I recorded it on this microphone, but I didn't have a pop filter. And he was like, that's okay. You don't need to re-record it. And I was literally like, it's really great news. The first 2 days in the studio were the 15th and the 16th of May 2021, and that's when we went to the studio to record the drums. I was a bit nervous because I've already mentioned there were no rehearsals. And basically when I started putting the album together, the drummer from the first album was supposed to appear on this record, but halfway through he changed his mind, so I had to find a new drummer. I heard a lot of good things about William, who ended up recording the album. I knew that he was a great drummer, but I was still pretty nervous because no rehearsals, I didn't know what kind of drummer he was, I didn't know how well he would be playing. I actually got to meet him for the first time in the studio. It took us around 2 to 3 hours to set up the drums. And on the first day, he recorded 5 of the songs. We started with Distant Faces in the Dark because that mid section is just really difficult. Then we did Pen Haters, then he did Lonely Crossings. You can see this little clip where we were in a main room and he was recording.
Oh yeah.
Then he also recorded Wrong Doors, and there are a couple of shots from the studio that you can see. One thing I forgot to mention, it was pretty impressive that he brought his own notes. He had a notepad where he wrote the notes, like the rhythm, because some of the tracks have a lot of time signature changes and all of the progressive metal shenanigans. And you can see some of the footage where he was making sure that he understands the rhythm and that he gets the hang of it.
A tam už potom ideš normálne, hej, to už zákulisné ťahy.
Potom speve.
To musíš tak vidieť.
Jasné, už viem, dobre, poď ešte raz.
And then he recorded it. And if you know the song Wrong Doors, you will probably recognize the mid section where we go synthwave prog metal. And then the chorus. I actually slept in the studio, so one of the things that was really cool about the relocated studio is that there was this place above the main room where 4 people could essentially sleep over, so I slept over a couple nights in the studio. He also recorded My Biggest Fall, so that was on the first day. When he came on the second day, he recorded Vortex Fragoris, where basically it was about parts 2, 3, and 6. He also recorded Pioneers of Modern Narcissism, and that was it when it comes to drums. And then he had this Octapad, which is like a pad with a lot of the electronic drum sounds, and that's when he recorded Golden Times and some of the sections in Lonely Crossings. Even though I was in a great shape vocally, which you can hear on the record, I was in a very bad shape when it came to my bass guitar, because at that point I hadn't been practicing for maybe like 2 years. After these 2 days in the studio, I took like a month. I practiced like at least an hour per day the bass to really get my chops back. And that's when I started recording the bass. Most of the bass guitar was still recorded in the house of Julie's parents. That's where we lived. It was actually a very crazy period because I was going to work. I had a little son who was like 2 years old. We were working on our house, rebuilding all of the stuff here because we wanted to move there. Plus I was making the album. I think very few people would be able to pull this off, and I almost lost my mental health on a couple of occasions. So that's gonna be in the video about everything that went wrong with the album. So most of the fretted bass guitars I recorded there. I started with Wrong Doors because Wrong Doors is half a step lower from the tuning I use, so I wanted to get that over with so that I could tune up my bass back and just use it for the rest of the tracks. So here you can see Wrong Doors, how I recorded the main riff.
Oh.
There's the bridge. The bridge has a different sound because I was reamping a lot of the bass guitars. I was always recording the clear sound, like the direct in sound and the affected sound, and then later on I could alter some of the sounds. So that bridge actually had a different overdrive setting because I just wanted a different sound essentially. And then that mid section. I gotta say that it was really difficult because when I was recording the first album, and you can see that in the studio documentary for the first album, I was really enjoying it. And whenever I recorded something, Roman would react to me like, try to be more in time, or you were rushing a little bit, or try to have more feel when you play. And now there was no feedback. I had to basically do two jobs, being the recording engineer and being the bass player. And it was so frustrating so many times. I definitely enjoyed it a lot less than I did the first album. Then you can see the Fan Haters midsection. That metal midsection has the fretted bass.
The best album of the decade is being recorded. Let's fucking do it.
The main riff from Pioneers, which I actually played kind of weirdly. I do play it much more technically now. And Distant Faces in the Dark. And also Vortex Fragoris Part 1, where you hear all those textures on the bass guitar. When it comes to the keyboards, Shimon, I will call him Simon from now on, he joined us basically at the end of June. There was a different keyboard player who was supposed to be on the album, but after a year he told me like, sorry dude, I can't make it, like, great. We had like an audition session, and then when Simon came to record the first track, which was My Biggest Foe, he brought his father's keyboard and he was like, I've got a keyboard, it's gonna be pretty good. And it wasn't. It had such shitty sounds, it was just terrible. He ended up recording piano in that track, which was really great, but I knew that we had a problem because he was only 15 years old at the time when he recorded the album, and he had zero experience with arranging the songs, which was big difference from Stevie on the first album. But in terms of the playing with sounds and coming up with a lot of synth sounds and stuff, of course, had to be my job. And we borrowed the stage piano from Stevie, so it's the same one that the first album was recorded on. And we only used, I think, one sound from it, but it was more like a reference point. It was a big piano where we could like record everything MIDI-wise, and most of the sounds that you can hear, all of the pianos and Hammond organs and strings, all of that is basically from the plugins in the studio. But there were similar sounds in that piano, in that keyboard, so we could use that as a reference point. Here you can see Simon recording Distant Faces in the Dark using Stevie's keyboard. And at that point I had already had quite a lot of the synth sounds, you know, that I used mainly from Zoya, the pedal Zoya. You can learn more about it in the sounds behind that I made for every track. That alone wasn't enough for all of the synth sounds I wanted for the record, and I knew that I wanted a dedicated synthesizer that I would use for the record. I had been already doing some research at that point, and it was the Korg Minilog XD, one of the best-selling synthesizers that I wanted. But Thomann, which is like the biggest music gear site in Germany, Korg Minilog XD was sold out, and we're talking like early July, and they were supposed to have new ones in September, and I was like, I can't wait until September. And fortunately, like a day later, I found an ad. There was a guy trying to sell his own Korg because he just wasn't using it. So I called him, I got a really great deal, and my wife's twin sister was about to come home. I called her and asked her if she was willing to take a detour to get that keyboard. So like 3 or 4 days later, I had the synthesizer at my house. That was cool. In the next clip, he's recording the choruses of Distant Faces in the Dark, which is the first thing that we use the Korg Minilog XD for.
Je to také tanečné až trošku, ale v dobrom akože, že... Samozrejme v tej skladbe to bude trošku viac ponorené, dnuka do hudby, že nebude to až tak, ale... Dobre, takže...
Nedá sa vyčistiť toto?
Môžeš aj dohrať, keď chceš.
Potiahol.
A to je jednoduchá funkcia, len tu máš také víš potiahne, že máš.
Jednoduchá funkcia, neviem robiť s Excelom,
Pozri, s Excelom ani ja.
Here are some more clips of me recording bass. This is part 2, Vortex Fragoris. some fucked up takes from part 3 where you can just see the frustration, and this is a pretty good clip showing how it was for the most part, I guess. The last song I recorded there was My Biggest Foe, the first track using the fretless bass. Basically, it was kind of an experiment. I recorded like one take. I was like, let's do one take. And it wasn't as good as I thought, but fortunately Roman was good at editing, so don't tell anybody. I wanna get away from this cage. I am made. Before the fight begins, I gotta break free. Sing with me. Oh, 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 oh. I shouldn't be the victim of an ideal. I've said, gotta break free. Recording bass and keyboards was pretty okay because these are like digital instruments, they don't really make much sound. When it came to like all of the other stuff, saxophones and vocals, I knew that we needed to have a separate room. So I went to the house where we live. This is like a double house and we were rebuilding the house where we live, but at front we have like this old house that we didn't really touch, we didn't really do anything with it. And there was this one room that I set up at a studio. The first time I set up everything there was the first time Lucas came over to record his saxophone. So on that first day he recorded all of the pop songs, so My Biggest Foe, Lonely Crossings and Golden Times. There was basically nothing in the room. I was sitting behind the table, facing the window, he was behind me. After like 2 days he came over again, and this is where I have some footage that I will show you. He was recording Distant Faces in the Dark, and it was quite funny because he didn't know the song. So he took like a couple hours to learn the song, maybe like up to 2 hours. And then we recorded him. You can already see me facing him. I like how he's swearing where he messes something, and there were quite a few of these as we were recording. Next footage shows Simon at a new place recording the synths for Pioneers of Modern Narcissism.
Skúsaj do tých prázdnych, hej.
Aj tam, kde je na saxofón. Si hovoril, že je možnosť hrať D, E alebo D, Fis. Tak ktoré teraz?
Pozrieme, čo som nahral na basu. To je saxofonista.
And some Hammond for fan haters.
Zaujímavé, že keď som vypínal kameru, mal som 97% batérie, teraz mám 98%.
At the new place, I also recorded most of the fretless bass guitars, so vast majority of the Fan Haters track, Lonely Crossings, the footage of which I lost for some reason, and also the main solo in Golden Time, so you can check it out now.
Careful, buddy, careful.
Okay.
An interesting fact that I didn't mention before is that Simon was supposed to have 2 keyboard solos on this album. One of the things that really makes the first album so great is that the saxophone player has 9 saxophone solos. There are 2 bass solos, 1 synth solo and 1 drum solo, and obviously I wanted to go for something similar on Pursuits 2. There are 8 saxophone solo, 2-ish bass solos, and that's it. Simon was supposed to have solo in Fan Haters, so I'm just gonna play you a very rough demo where the whole solo is like 25 seconds and he was basically supposed to play like first 12 seconds and then Lucas was supposed to play, but when it comes to Lucas, we just kind of went with the whole solo because it was really not enough time for him to come up with anything interesting. And another keyboard solo or piano solo that Simon was supposed to have was actually in Vortex Fragoris. When part 3 is ending, you have this kind of a long instrumental section, and that's where he came up with this really interesting solo, which eventually didn't make it to the record because I felt it didn't really have the same vibe and same atmosphere, and it was disrupting in that regard a little bit. But still, it was pretty impressive, and here you can see him recording it. We're gonna go back to the saxophone, and in the next clip you can see that the room looks a bit different. We created a vocal booth with my wife because the room still had quite a lot of reverb going on, some reflections, and I checked some theory, and basically you can create your own vocal booth with just sheets or blankets or whatever. And Julie, my wife, is very, very handy, so she created a vocal booth for me. And I was a bit skeptical. I was like, there's no way this is gonna work. And it worked perfectly. It made the vocals super dry. So here you can see Lucas again recording. And this was an interesting thing because when it comes to the saxophone solos, basically we had 3 takes approach with Lucas, meaning that he would do 3 takes, and if he couldn't come up with a usable take in those first 3 takes, he probably wouldn't be able to come up with anything in other takes. And this was pretty apparent with Pioneers of Modern Narcissism, My Biggest Four, Fan Haters, where basically he had anywhere from 5 to 8 takes, and I just like took different parts and I created those solos, and they are amazing. But of course there were saxophone solos where he just came in and he nailed it, you know, Lonely Crossings, that was the only solo that he had ready before the recording. Golden Times, that was like the third take. Almost the entire Vortex Fragoris solo is like the first take. And here in this next clip, I was recording him for like 10 minutes on the camera, and he was trying to come up with a solo for Wrong Doors. And the first couple of solos are a bit uninspired and random and not very good. And there's some footage of me trying to explain to him what he could play. And then he nailed it. He really did it in one take. It might have been like the fourth or the fifth, but we weren't really saving up all those other takes. But it was really interesting. Great solo. If you know the song, you will notice that that final phrase is not there because that's something we edit a bit later on. But yeah, the final solo you can witness in the next footage.
Nepočujem nič do piči.
Pozri, buď bude nejaký, napríklad nejaký tón skončíš,
Na jednom to ne?
kľudne na jednom, maximálne kus to prestredaj, že ako...
No dobra, daj ešte raz. Ešte raz. Nič sa mňa nevidieť dneska asi, ja neviem.
Ale hej, tam nejaké ešte trošku, sú tam dobré veci. Najviac sa mi páči to, že čím ďalej, tým skôr začínaš. vieš, že prvýkrát si začínal ako keby na tej osminy, takže na prvá, druhá, tretia, štvrtá, ako keby prvá, hej, aj druhé. Tretie si začal jednu pred, toto si už začal tri pred. Ty to pustím, aby si
Lebo ja nepočujem dobre ani saxofón, ani toto. Tak už keď na to začnem hrať, to už to vôbec netučím.
Dobre.
To je zlé!
Ja ti pustím ten prvý take, počúvaj teraz, a takto asi si chcel začať. Počkaj tam na bicie, hej, jak... Ja by som to ešte možno trošku v tom závere, ak ide už len, čo už nejde riff, už idú len tie akordy, ešte tam by som to nejak melodicky tak zaujímavejšie spravil.
And there's also some footage of him recording Vortex Fragoris, the track.
Vieš čo, Lukáš, trošku počkaj, kým ťa dám nahrávať, hej, potom nahrávať.
Počkaj, bo sa smeje, musím zavrieť. No.
Stačí zapnúť kameru a už nevieš viac.
No.
však ja by som to nahral aj bez kliku. Ten klik som si vôbec ani nevšimol.
Ja napríklad by som si aj s klikom nahral.
When it comes to the lead vocals, I recorded some of the songs in the beginning of August where I did Wrong Doors. I still remember when I recorded Wrong Doors, I had 3 takes and all of the takes were totally different because like the microphone was set up differently. I was still trying to figure out how to set up the microphone properly. Then the next day I did Lonely Crossings and I recorded it in the morning almost immediately after I had woken up. And it was so funny because usually when I was recording vocals, it was better in the evening or at night because it was more quiet. And I was recording Lonely Crossings in the morning and I finished one line and the car drove by in front of the house and you can hear it on the take. Who are forsaken. On the same day I did Fan Haters and then a couple days later at midnight I was recording the vocals for Distant Faces and Pioneers, and this is the only footage of me recording vocals for the album. I don't know, it was just too intimate for me to really record myself, but to have the feel of what it looked like, here's me recording Pioneers.
It's midnight and that means it's time to sing. Okay. Hey!
Lost in the matrix, we depend on how our lives are rated. These cyber veins take control somehow. What pleases our brains. I also recorded Golden Times and then in early September I finished recording the vocals for My Biggest Foe and Vortex Fragoris. I also had the vocalists, 3 vocalists who recorded most of the vocals in August and some of them in September. I don't have any footage, just the photos. So there was Marko Hunja and Jakub Ferenc. They're both in a group called Tarverb, but Marko also has another progressive metal group. There were 2 sessions with them where they recorded all of the backing vocals. Marko was the lead backing vocalist, Jakub was there just to provide some additional vocals. He wasn't that good, but he was usable. And then there was Vaneska Lalikova. Vaneska was at that time my student at Business Academy where I teach. And she also had 2 sessions where she recorded all of her vocals. You can hear her very clearly in the verses of Fan Haters or in Golden Times. And you can hear Marko probably most clearly in that metal section of Fan Haters. Then in September, all 3 vocalists came again because there were a few corrections we had to do. Like for example, Distant Faces in the Dark. We recorded it. Distant Faces in the Dark, long lost echoes of my past. And I was like, that doesn't rhyme. Dark past, it should be dark past. So they re-recorded some of these things and we did all of those chords or whatever in My Biggest Foe, for example. But also in Distant Faces in the Dark, the riffs originally had some of these whoa, you know, these screams and these chords, but I decided not to use it for obvious reasons. Fun story, I asked Vaneska one more time to come, I think in October, because in Golden Times there is this line, as they won't occur, and originally I recorded as they won't occur, not occur, as they won't occur. And I asked her at school, like, would you be willing to come back to re-record one word? And she was like, yeah, of course. Very cool work with the vocalists, and I think they did a hell of a job. In September, basically, I just kept recording some of the additional synths. For example, I used Casio, my keyboard, for recording bass synths into Golden Times. Then Zoya is a pedal effect with my MIDI controller I used for all of the synth sounds basically that you can hear in Golden Times. Sometimes these moments bring me tears of joy. Sometimes they bring regret when they are gone. Sometimes I just wish that I could feel that void in me. And then you can see me using cork for that cool sound in the midsection of Wrong Doors.
Okay. So. Nice.
October was mostly used for some corrections. I will still take certain lead vocals and change a sentence here, a line here, considering the perfectionist I am. I just really wanted the record to be perfect. And the album was mixed mostly in November. I think there were like 5 or 6 different mixes of the album, even though not every mix included every track. The album was basically done by the end of 21. In mid-December, we had a listening party with some of my friends and some of the band members. I think the only thing we added in 2022 was that in Vortex Fragoris in part 2, I wanted bass up by a few decibels, and that's the only thing. So most of the record was done in 2021, 99.9% of it actually. Even like the music video for Wrong Doors, we actually shot it in November 2021. So the record had to be finished by that point. And together, I think I spent around 9 days in the studio altogether. Of course, not in a row, but during May, August, September, October. Every time I went to the studio, I took my pedal board and my computer and all of that stuff. It was really useful in some of those situations where certain tracks were not exported properly. Also, after 8 hours of working in a studio and after everybody had left it, when I was left alone in the studio, I would still turn on the computer and work on the sounds, fine-tuning them for a couple hours. So it was an incredible amount of work. So yeah, making of this album was a real journey. It was very, very difficult. At the end of the day, the only thing I regret is not enjoying the process all that much, because in summer 21 there were days when I would work 13 hours on the record, and at that point it was more of a job and more of a chore than really enjoyment. And considering that I had to balance my personal life, being with my wife and my kid, working on a house, working on a record, it was an incredibly difficult period, and I'm glad I pulled it off, and I really hope I will never go through anything like this ever again. Yeah, I guess that's it. So thanks a lot for watching.
I shouldn't be